You know, Paul, I'm totally with you on this, but why don't you allow women to teach and have authority over men? Yeah, I never said that.
All right, let's see it.
Have you never read your own words? You literally say in 1 Timothy 2:12, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, rather she is to remain quiet.
So I've already responded to a very similar video from this content creator about 1 Corinthians 14 verses 34 and 35, where in a very similar way, Paul is insisting that women not speak in church but remain silent. Now, in that video, there are two different positions that have probably equal weight among scholars. One is that Paul was quoting the people of Corinth and then was going to overturn their understanding. And the other conclusion, the one that I endorsed in that video, is that those two verses were an interpolation. Someone added them later to Paul's text, probably after he had died, but probably not too long after he had died. In this video, the scholarship is much clearer. There is a strong consensus among scholars that the pastoral epistles, so that would be 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, were not written by Paul, and were probably written decades after his death, toward the end of the 1st century CE, beginning of the 2nd century CE. And it could be that whoever is responsible for writing the pastoral epistles, or at least 1 Timothy 2, is also responsible for that interpolation into 1 Corinthians 14. You can see my video number McClellan 2398 for a lengthier discussion of the reasons that the majority of scholars are convinced that the pastoral epistles were not written until long after Paul's death. But when it comes to 1 Timothy 2, I don't see a need to try to renegotiate away what seems to be the surface meaning of this text, because as with the majority of scholars, I don't think this was written by Paul. This was written by someone writing decades after his death who did not have Paul's authority and was probably just trying to push back against what they didn't like, which was more women having authority in the Christian church. And as we can see in texts like Romans and others, Paul was perfectly fine with women having ecclesiastical authority, going so far as to praise a woman named Junia as an apostle. So Paul very clearly didn't have a problem with women exercising ecclesiastical authority, and 1 Timothy 2 is probably pseudepigraphical.
Do you ever research historical context, or what do you mean it's a straight reading of the text? What context do I need? Okay, I'll explain it to you. See, I was writing to Timothy, who was in Ephesus, and in Ephesus, they had a god called Artemis. Now, Artemis had priestesses. In fact, the whole religious culture in Ephesus was ran by women. So you wouldn't see men leading any of the religious activities. It was ran solely by women. So when they came into the church, when Ephesus began to get the gospel, the women that were previously worshipers of Artemis were usurping authority over the men that were teaching, because in their minds, religion was a female thing.
So this is just not supported by any data. There is absolutely no evidence that any such thing happened. And while the Artemis cult did predominate in 1st century CE Ephesus, there were other cults in the area that involved men, and there were men involved in the cult of Artemis. There were eunuchs who worked in the temple. There were non-eunuch men who were associated with the economic and the civic administration of the temple, and there were men who worshipped Artemis in the temple and outside the temple. So there was no monopoly or stranglehold on the priesthood or on worship or on religion in general in Ephesus. This is something that was just made up as part of a campaign to come up with a rationalization for how we can maintain the inspiration and the goodness of what is stated in 1 Timothy 2:12, while also denying that this is a global prohibition on women holding ecclesiastical authority. But I think on the surface, that seems to be what this is. And while I think this is a well-meaning attempt to overcome the patriarchal orientation of this passage, I don't think it's following the data. I think it's doing what a lot of apologetics do. It is starting with a predetermined conclusion and then skirting around the data to try to arrive at that conclusion. So it's doing what an awful lot of apologetics does, even though in this case it would be a conclusion that aligns with my own personal interests and rhetorical goals, but I just don't think it's following the data there.
But you said you don't allow women to exercise authority over men. There's no context in that. So that's a translation issue. Actually, the word in the Greek there more closely means to usurp in a violent manner. So I'm actually prohibiting women from violently usurping the authority of the men that were placed in charge.
So this is just not true, and for two main reasons. The first is the context. The other thing that Paul says women are not supposed to do is teach, and then concludes by saying they must be silent. So to say women can't teach and also can't violently exercise authority over men but are to be silent doesn't make an awful lot of sense. To say that women aren't to teach or to exercise authority at all over men but are to be silent is much more consistent, not only to the context but also to the sense of the verb aphenteo in Koine Greek. Aphenteo comes from a verb that basically meant to initiate an action. So in classical Greek, it was used to mean a perpetrator of something, usually something bad, and in some contexts it was used to refer to homicide. But by the time of Koine Greek, the sense had broadened to someone who was supreme, someone who exercised authority over others, someone who ruled. Now, in context where it is indicated, it could refer to violent, despotic, domineering authority or rule, but that context is needed in order to indicate that nuance. Otherwise, it was a pretty generic and neutral reference to having authority. So it could refer to the master of a slave. It could also refer to just someone who led a group. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with violence, with despotism, with unrighteous authority or anything like that. And this context very clearly does not suggest violence, despotism, or anything like that. It suggests just exercising ecclesiastical authority. So both the context and the use of this word elsewhere in Koine Greek indicate that this claim is not accurate.
Okay, so what you're saying is that this is actually a problem with translation, that you would allow women to teach and even exercise authority over men as long as they're not literally wresting control from them. Exactly. And I can tell that you're reading the English Standard Bible. Why don't you do a little bit of research and figure out why the English Standard Bible was made?
So I don't think this is a good argument, but I understand that for folks who are in a position where they want to maintain the authentic and inspired nature of 1 Timothy 2, are going to look for an argument that allows them to sidestep the notion that this is a global prohibition on women exercising ecclesiastical authority. I do think the concluding thought, the English Standard Version, check out where it comes from, is a good point, because the English Standard Version is a very patriarchal, very misogynistic, very complementarian approach to Bible translation. It exists really only because there were other Bible translations from within the evangelical movement that were going to publish editions that used more gender-inclusive language. So instead of talking about brothers, it was going to say brothers and sisters or siblings or things like that. And so a bunch of men got together in Colorado Springs and said, this aggression will not stand. We're going to come up with our own translation that is going to make sure women know their place. And whenever there are decisions to be made that affect complementarianism or the role of women and authority, overwhelmingly they side with the complementarian reading, and that is phenomenally problematic. And there are other problems with it as well. And you can check out these two papers from Sam Perry for good arguments for why the ESV is wildly problematic. So while I appreciate that final thought, I don't think this argument is particularly convincing, and I think the best way to approach this is just to acknowledge that 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy and Titus were just not written by Paul. They were written decades after Paul's death by someone who really didn't like women having authority. And the fit for this video has been Wolverine.